Catherine's refusal was not an emotional reaction. It was the final step in a decision she had apparently been carrying alone for much longer than anyone realized. And when the hidden pieces began to connect, even those closest to the royal household understood that this was about far more than Camilla. For weeks, Catherine had been preparing herself for a conversation she knew could change the balance inside the family. She had listened, watched, remembered, and most importantly, she had waited. To those around her, that silence looked like uncertainty. Some believed she was struggling to choose between family harmony and personal conviction. Others assumed time would soften her position, but they had misunderstood the silence completely. Catherine was not hesitating. She was calculating. She understood something that palace life teaches its members very early. The most dangerous decisions are rarely made in anger. They are made quietly, after every consequence has been considered. And Catherine had begun examining those consequences one by one. The pressure on her was enormous. The monarchy depended on appearances of unity, even when private relationships were complicated. Disagreement could be forgiven. Open division was something else entirely. Catherine knew that refusing Camilla would not simply create hurt feelings. It could force old loyalties into the open, expose disagreements that had remained carefully buried, and make people choose between personalities and principle. Then came the argument that had protected royal arrangements for generations. Precedent. Certain things, she was reminded, had always been done a certain way. Certain decisions had always belonged to certain people. Certain compromises had always been accepted because that was how the institution survived. It was a powerful argument because it sounded less like pressure and more like duty. But Catherine had begun asking a dangerous question. What if precedent was not protecting the monarchy anymore? What if it was preventing it from changing? That was where her approach began to separate from Camilla's. Camilla's strength rested in persuasion, experience, and the weight of tradition. Catherine's strength was different. She could wait. She could absorb pressure without immediately responding to it. And while others were trying to convince her, she was quietly reviewing the decisions, promises, expectations, and compromises that had shaped the royal household before her. The more she examined them, the clearer one conclusion became. Accepting Camilla's request might solve the immediate problem, but it could create a precedent that would return later with far greater consequences. Once Catherine surrendered on this matter, what would prevent the same expectation from being placed upon her again? And if she accepted it now, would she still have the authority to refuse when the stakes became even higher? That realization created the deepest conflict of all. Catherine understood the personal cost of saying no. She knew there would be disappointment, resentment, and perhaps a wound that would not easily close. Yet she also believed that saying yes would cost something even greater, the ability to decide where her own boundaries ended and royal obligation began. So she made her choice, and this time, Catherine would not defend it with another argument. She would act. Catherine had won the private argument, but the real battle was only beginning, because her next decision would force everyone else to choose a side. The palace did not hear about Catherine's decision through an official announcement. It spread through whispers, guarded conversations, and stunned reactions. Within hours, people who thought they understood the royal hierarchy were asking the same dangerous question. Had Catherine just changed the rules without asking permission? The answer was becoming harder to ignore. What Catherine had done was supposed to remain contained. It had begun as a private decision, carried out without ceremony, and without any attempt to turn it into a public confrontation. But inside a royal household, information rarely stays where it begins. A carefully chosen sentence reaches one advisor. A concern is mentioned to a trusted aide. Someone notices that a familiar arrangement has suddenly changed. Then, another person asks why. And before anyone realizes what is happening, a private decision becomes palace knowledge. The first reactions were divided. Some saw Catherine's move as an act of courage. They believed she had finally refused to allow pressure, tradition, or personal relationships to dictate a decision that could affect her future. Others saw something far more dangerous. To them, Catherine had not simply protected a boundary. She had challenged an understanding that had survived because members of the royal family knew when to accept, when to compromise, and when to remain silent. There were also those who feared what could happen next. Because once one royal refuses to follow an established pattern, others begin asking whether they are expected to follow it too. Camilla understood that immediately. Her refusal to accept Catherine's position was no longer the only problem. The greater problem was that Catherine had acted decisively, and the decision was now being discussed by people who had never been part of their original conversation. What had begun between two women was becoming a question about authority, loyalty, and the future shape of the monarchy. Charles was suddenly caught between two pressures that could not easily be reconciled. On one side was family harmony, with all the emotional history and personal loyalties that came with it. On the other was institutional stability. The monarchy could survive disagreement behind closed doors. What it could not easily survive was the impression that those at its center were pulling in different directions. Advisors began looking for ways to contain the situation. Perhaps Catherine could reconsider. Perhaps the decision could be softened. Perhaps a compromise could be created that allowed everyone to retreat without appearing to lose. But Catherine would not move, and that refusal made the situation even more serious. She understood what everyone else was beginning to fear. The moment this became public, the palace would lose control of the story. The public would not see every private conversation, every sacrifice, or every reason behind the decision. They would see a royal family divided over power. Yet Catherine seemed prepared to accept that risk, because somewhere beneath the immediate dispute was something older. An understanding from another time. A precedent that had been quietly preserved, rarely questioned, and perhaps never expected to become relevant again. Now it was. And if that buried understanding supported Catherine, her decision could become impossible to challenge. But if it did not, the very same history could destroy the argument she had built her position upon. But before anyone could force Catherine back into the old arrangement, something buried in the monarchy's past suddenly became impossible to ignore. There was a rule the palace rarely discussed, because acknowledging it would raise uncomfortable questions about power, inheritance, and who truly controls royal decisions. Catherine's advisors knew it. Camilla's circle knew it. And now, for the first time, Catherine appeared ready to use it. The rule had never needed to be written down in bold letters. That was precisely what made it so powerful. It existed through expectation, through habit, through generations of royal behavior that taught one simple lesson: there were boundaries members of the family did not cross, unless they were prepared to deal with the consequences. Everyone knew where those boundaries were. Almost nobody wanted to explain them. For generations, royal decisions had been shaped by understandings that went beyond formal authority. Inheritance was not simply about possessions. Royal objects were not merely valuable things. Ceremonial roles carried meaning. Public gestures could signal allegiance. Even seemingly private decisions could influence who gained authority tomorrow. And beneath all of it was the question the palace preferred to avoid: who truly has the right to decide what belongs to the future? That was where Camilla's plea had become unexpectedly dangerous. What she had asked Catherine to accept seemed, on the surface, like a personal matter. But Catherine had begun to understand that agreeing would establish something larger. It could create an expectation that certain private arrangements could continue simply because they had always existed. And once that expectation became accepted, reversing it later would become almost impossible. The old rule suddenly gave Catherine something she had not possessed during their original confrontation. Leverage. The moment the rule entered the discussion, the balance shifted. Catherine no longer had to argue only from emotion, fairness, or personal boundaries. She could point toward a tradition that had governed the royal family long before either woman stood at the center of this conflict. That made palace insiders deeply uncomfortable, because invoking an old understanding meant reopening old compromises. It meant asking why certain decisions had been made in the first place, who had benefited from them, and whether those arrangements were ever meant to continue indefinitely. Silence had protected everyone. Speaking could expose everyone. For Catherine, however, the danger was beginning to look different. She realized that she had spent too long defending her position as though she were asking permission to protect her own future. Now she understood that tradition itself could support her. That realization changed her. She no longer needed to convince every person in the palace that her refusal was justified. She needed only to make clear that there was a boundary older than the current disagreement, and that crossing it could affect the crown far beyond the present generation. But the most unsettling part was still ahead. Catherine was not preparing another explanation. She was preparing to change the status of something that had previously been controlled through private understanding, something connected to influence, expectation, and the future authority of the royal family. Once she acted, the decision would no longer belong entirely to Catherine and Camilla. It would become part of the crown itself. And that was the moment the dispute stopped being about one request, because Catherine was about to move the decision from the family circle into the future of the crown itself. Catherine could have answered Camilla with another private conversation. Instead, she chose a move that carried consequences far beyond either woman. It was quiet, perfectly controlled, and devastatingly simple, and by the time Camilla understood what Catherine had done, there was almost nothing left to undo. The decision itself was not dramatic. That was what made it so powerful. Catherine did not launch an accusation, demand an apology, or turn the disagreement into a public battle. She simply changed the arrangement that had allowed Camilla's request to remain possible in the first place. And suddenly, the conversation was over. Catherine had understood the lesson hidden inside the old rule. If she continued arguing about the decision, the matter would remain personal. If she changed the structure surrounding it, the argument would become institutional. That was the difference. She was no longer asking whether Camilla should be granted what she wanted. Catherine was deciding whether the circumstances that made such a request possible should continue at all. That distinction reached directly into the sensitive question of inheritance. Within the royal world, ownership and influence could never be treated as completely separate. What belonged to an individual could carry symbolic power, while something associated with the institution could eventually pass into another generation. Catherine's action drew a line between those two worlds. What had once been managed through private understanding would now be treated according to a principle that could outlast the people involved. For Camilla, the shock came from realizing that Catherine had not tried to defeat her personally. She had simply removed the space in which the disagreement could continue. There was no dramatic confrontation to fight against, no insult to answer, no public accusation to deny. Catherine had given Camilla nothing that could easily be challenged without making the entire dispute more visible. Charles faced an even harder problem. He could understand why Camilla was hurt. He could understand the importance of preserving family relationships. But Catherine's decision had been built on a principle that was difficult to dismiss without appearing to reject the very traditions the monarchy claimed to protect. That left him caught between affection and responsibility. Meanwhile, advisors began asking questions that had not seemed important before. What exactly had Catherine changed? Could the decision be reversed? Who had authority over the new arrangement? And most dangerously, would this become an example that future royals could use when confronting similar pressure? The implications reached far beyond the present conflict. Catherine knew that every royal decision becomes part of the institution's memory. What happens once can become precedent. What becomes precedent can become expectation. And what becomes expectation can shape the lives of people who have not even entered the story yet. That was why her move mattered. She had not attacked Camilla. She had not humiliated her. She had done something far more consequential. She had created a boundary that did not depend on either woman's feelings. For the palace, that realization was deeply unsettling. The old arrangement could no longer be assumed. The rules of engagement had changed, and Catherine had changed them without demanding permission. But the palace could still have contained the damage. It could have kept the disagreement private, limited the whispers, and allowed the public to believe nothing significant had happened. There was only one problem. The secret was already beginning to escape. Yet the palace could still have contained the damage if the outside world had remained unaware, and then the first signs appeared that the secret was already escaping. Nothing was officially announced, yet something had changed. The public noticed altered appearances, missing gestures, unusual silences, and a distance that seemed impossible to explain. Soon, speculation became conversation, conversation became headlines, and the palace discovered that silence could sometimes reveal more than words. At first, almost nobody knew what they were looking for. There was no formal statement, no public accusation, and no obvious declaration that something had gone wrong. Yet people began noticing small differences. A gesture that seemed absent. A moment that felt unusually restrained. A familiar pattern that suddenly appeared less certain. Individually, none of these details meant much. Together, they became a question. And once the public begins asking questions about the royal family, the palace has a problem that cannot always be solved with silence. The story had escaped the corridors where it began. People started interpreting every royal interaction as a possible clue. Supporters of Catherine saw the growing distance as evidence of strength. To them, she had finally demonstrated that she could make difficult decisions without allowing personal pressure to control her. Her refusal was no longer viewed as a private disagreement. It was becoming a symbol of independence. But not everyone saw it that way. Others began asking whether Catherine had gone too far. If Camilla had made a final appeal in good faith, why had Catherine responded so firmly? Was this really about principle, or had an old personal conflict finally reached a breaking point? The more people argued, the larger the story became. And that created a new danger for the monarchy. The greatest threat was no longer the decision itself, it was perception. The palace understood that reality could be complicated, but the public would not see every private conversation. They would see silence. They would notice distance. They would create explanations where official information was missing. Attempts were made to calm the situation. Different interpretations began circulating. Some suggested everything was normal. Others hinted that the disagreement had been exaggerated. The message was simple: there was nothing to see. But that strategy produced the opposite result. Every attempt to minimize the story made people more curious. Why was everyone insisting that nothing had happened? Why did the silence feel so deliberate? And why did Catherine appear increasingly unwilling to explain herself? For Catherine, this was the moment when the emotional cost became impossible to ignore. Her decision had once belonged to her. Then it belonged to the palace. Now it belonged partly to the public imagination. She could no longer control what people believed. She could only control what she did next. And the stakes were becoming larger than Catherine and Camilla. This was turning into a test of whether the monarchy could withstand an open struggle between two powerful royal figures without allowing the institution itself to appear divided. Catherine understood that eventually the questions would become too loud to avoid. The public would want an explanation. The press would demand one, and the palace would have to decide whether silence was still protecting the monarchy or beginning to damage it. Catherine already knew the answer. And when that demand finally came, Catherine faced a choice more dangerous than the original confrontation: remain silent, or tell the world why she refused. For years, Catherine had mastered the royal art of saying almost everything without revealing anything. But this time, silence was no longer protecting the institution. When she finally addressed the question surrounding Camilla's plea, her words were carefully chosen, and one detail left the nation stunned. She knew exactly what speaking would cost her. Until that moment, Catherine had allowed others to fill the silence with their own explanations. She had resisted the temptation to defend herself, resisted the pressure to explain every decision, and refused to turn a private disagreement into a public contest. But the pressure had changed. The public was no longer simply curious. They were beginning to form conclusions, and Catherine understood that allowing those conclusions to harden could be more damaging than telling the truth as she saw it. So she prepared to speak, not angrily, not personally, and certainly not as someone seeking revenge. That was what made the moment so powerful. Her language was respectful, almost careful enough to sound ordinary, yet beneath every sentence was a clear message. There were limits that even royal relationships could not cross. Catherine did not attack Camilla. She did not question her character or reopen every painful detail behind the dispute. Instead, she described her decision as part of a responsibility larger than herself. She spoke about duty, continuity, and the need to protect something that would remain long after individual disagreements had disappeared. That framing changed everything. Suddenly, the conflict was no longer simply Catherine versus Camilla. Catherine was presenting herself as someone choosing the institution over personal comfort. And that came with an emotional price, because protecting the monarchy meant accepting that some people inside it might feel betrayed. Catherine knew that. She knew her words could deepen an existing wound, and that once spoken publicly, they could never be taken back. Yet she continued. Then came the distinction that transformed the entire dispute. Catherine made it clear, directly or indirectly, that forgiveness did not mean permission. A person could be forgiven without being given the authority to shape a future decision. A relationship could be respected without allowing that relationship to determine institutional boundaries. That idea struck the public with unusual force. The controversy suddenly looked different. What had appeared to be a personal rejection now looked like a deliberate statement about power. Camilla, meanwhile, was left facing a reality that silence had previously kept hidden. Catherine was not leaving the door slightly open for another private appeal. She was closing it through principles that would be much harder to challenge. Charles faced the same uncomfortable truth. The public could now see that there were competing visions of what the monarchy should become. One vision valued continuity through established relationships and traditions. The other demanded that those traditions evolve when they threatened the future. And Catherine's decision suggested something even more significant. Perhaps royal power did not always require confrontation. Perhaps the strongest move was to establish a boundary so clearly that others eventually had to operate within it. That possibility changed the stakes entirely. Because Catherine had done more than explain herself. She had demonstrated a new way of exercising influence, quietly, deliberately, and without surrendering control of the narrative. The public had heard her. The palace had heard her. And Camilla had heard something even more difficult. The last path back into the old arrangement was closing. Yet the greatest consequence was still waiting. Because Catherine's words had settled the argument in public, but behind the palace walls, they had triggered a confrontation that could determine what the monarchy becomes next. The confrontation was over, but the consequences had only begun. Catherine had refused Camilla, changed the balance inside the palace, and forced the monarchy to confront a question it had avoided for years. When tradition and the future collide, who gets to decide which one survives? There was no easy return to what had existed before. The disagreement had changed something deeper than a single relationship. It had changed expectations. Inside the royal family, people now understood that certain assumptions could no longer be taken for granted. Old loyalties remained, but they were no longer enough to settle every question. Tradition still mattered. Duty still mattered. Family still mattered. But Catherine had demonstrated that none of them automatically gave another person the right to determine her decisions. That was her real transformation. She had entered the conflict as someone navigating a system built long before her. She emerged from it as someone willing to shape that system herself. And that distinction could define the future of the crown. For Camilla, however, the outcome was far more complicated than simple defeat. Her plea had failed, but her influence had not disappeared. She remained part of the royal structure, part of its history, and part of the emotional reality Catherine could not simply erase. That made the aftermath harder. There was no clean victory. No perfect reconciliation. No moment when every wound suddenly disappeared. Instead, there was an uneasy understanding that the relationship had entered a different chapter. Charles faced perhaps the most difficult position of all. He had to preserve family harmony while accepting that the monarchy itself was changing. The old structure depended on compromise, but Catherine had shown that compromise had limits. And those limits reached into questions far larger than personal relationships. Inheritance, loyalty, ceremonial authority, royal duty. Who controls something today could influence who controls it tomorrow. A decision made for one generation could become the expectation imposed upon the next. That was why Catherine's choice mattered beyond the immediate dispute. Her greatest victory was never really about defeating Camilla. It was about refusing to let personal pressure determine an institutional decision. But power has a price. The more authority Catherine gained, the more isolated she could become. Every boundary she established created another person who might feel excluded by it. Every decision made independently reduced the possibility of simply returning to the old pattern of pleasing everyone. She had gained control. But control could become its own burden. And somewhere beyond the present generation, future royals would inherit the consequences. They might inherit stronger boundaries, clearer expectations, and a monarchy less willing to hide difficult questions behind tradition. Or they might inherit something far more complicated, a family still divided over where tradition ends and personal authority begins. That was the lesson the palace could no longer unlearn. Catherine was not merely waiting for the future anymore. She had begun deciding what that future would look like. And that left one final question hanging over everything that came after. Had Catherine's bold decision protected the monarchy from an old pattern of pressure and compromise? Or had she quietly created an entirely new struggle, one that future generations would eventually have to finish?